Yo, what's good, fam? Welcome back. Or if you're new, buckle up, 'cause we're about to get loud. Today's vibe: why African girls don't marry into rich families. Folktales of rebellion and wit. Yeah, I said it. Forget the Hollywood script where the girl swoons for the rich guy with the castle. In African folktales, we don't play that. We're talking queens who look at gold and go, nah, I'm good. Today, we're zeroing in on one legend, a West African baddie named Chiamaka, who took on a chief so full of himself he probably slept with a mirror. This isn't some dusty old tale. It's a clapback in story form, served with sass and a side of shade. Chiamaka about to show you why wealth doesn't impress when you've got a brain that cuts like a blade. So grab your drink, hit that subscribe if you're not already in the crew, and let's get into this. You ready? 'Cause Adama sure is. Long before that heated moment, Chiamaka's village bustled with the energy of market stalls, goat bleats, and the faint clang of distant blacksmith shops. Chiamaka was a gifted weaver who thrived in her small hut near a towering baobab tree. Others might have underestimated her simple lifestyle, yet nobody questioned her skill. Her hands worked magic on a loom, weaving bright colours and striking patterns that traders were desperate to buy. Even though her textiles were in high demand, she remained modest about her success. She refused to chase status. Each cloth she created was a statement of her freedom. It was how she made her living, and more importantly, how she crafted her life. She lived on her own terms, controlled her own finances, and never let the opinions of others sway her from what she thought was right. The villagers admired her, but they also whispered about her. Some said she was too direct or too outspoken. But if Chiamaka ever heard these remarks, she simply shrugged and carried on. She had no interest in marriage for the sake of marriage, no interest in wealth for the sake of wealth. To those who told her she might regret turning down comfortable offers of security, she would gently remind them that her own efforts already provided all the security she needed. As news of Chiamaka's remarkable weaving spread across neighbouring regions, it eventually reached the ears of Chief Odion. He was known far beyond his own village for his lavish lifestyle, his towering compound, and his brazen assumption that his status placed him above ordinary people. Already married multiple times, Odion craved the novelty of marrying someone who intrigued him, even if only for a brief spark of excitement. Once he spotted Chiamaka at her loom during a regional festival. His curiosity turned into determination. Chief Odion arrived in her village with a procession of cattle and porters carrying his wealth. He was a striking sight, his layered jewellery reflecting the sun's rays. He expected immediate acceptance, perhaps even awe. In his mind, any woman he approached should be thrilled by his attention. But when he made his intentions known to Chiamaka, loudly proclaiming that his riches could give her anything she wanted, she barely looked up from her loom. People gathered around the encounter. The chief's proposal sounded like a grand promise of an easy life, filled with servants and the finest clothes. Yet Chiamaka did not appear interested. She calmly continued weaving, pausing only to inform him that wealth alone did not impress her. Many in the crowd had never witnessed such a direct refusal, especially from someone who earned a humble living. Word travelled through the village that the proud chief had been rejected. Some thought Chiamaka's refusal was bold, while others felt she had been foolish. Odion, however, was not used to hearing the word no. He returned to her hut the next day, offering even more: a life in his massive compound, protection, valuable gifts to her family. Still, Chiamaka did not waver. Finally, exasperated by Odion's relentless attempts, she decided to make her boundary crystal clear. If the chief was truly determined to win her over, he would first have to prove that his mind was as impressive as his fortune. She set forth a riddle for him to solve. If he guessed correctly within 3 days, she would enter his home willingly. But if he failed, he would have to leave her and her village in peace. A hush fell over the people who had gathered to watch. Nobody ever made conditions for Chief Odion. It was always the other way around. Yet Chiamaka's eyes showed no fear. She presented her riddle calmly. There was an object full of holes which could still hold water and was used to catch things while not actually being a net. She left the chief and his followers with that perplexing clue, noting that they had 3 days before her patience ran out. On the first day, the village square hummed with excitement. Small children jostled for a good spot to see the chief. The older villagers exchanged guesses in hushed voices. The general sense was that Odion would solve this riddle quickly. After all, the man was wealthy enough to hire the wisest advisors in the region. As noon approached, Odion returned with confidence. His advisors had told him the answer must be a basket. Baskets were woven, had holes, and could hold certain things. In front of the gathered villagers, the chief declared his first guess, but Chiamaka only shook her head, unruffled. In her calm way, she explained that a basket's holes were too big for water to remain inside. Then she reminded him that he had 2 more days. The crowd was stunned. Even more shocking was Chiamaka's quiet amusement, as if Odion's wrong guess had barely surprised her. People whispered that perhaps the weaver's riddle was more complicated than they had assumed. That night, Odion felt the first real strain on his pride. He was accustomed to commanding entire villages, summoning help with a snap of his fingers, and ordering rare goods from distant lands. But a single riddle threatened to unravel that self-assured image. He paced in his lavish compound, piling up possible solutions with his advisors. Their guesses ranged from carved gourds to exotic fish traps, each suggestion tested in a clay basin filled with water. None of them functioned as described in the riddle. Odion's wives looked on with concern as he dismissed one guess after another. They saw how the chief's frustration deepened. He refused to rest that night, convinced that the right guess was within reach if he only applied himself. But morning came, and he still had no confident answer. On the second day, Odion arrived in the village square with a fishing contraption he had acquired overnight. He was tired, but tried to mask his exhaustion behind forced bravado. The crowd, always eager for drama, seemed even larger than the day before. They parted to let him stand face to face with the weaver once again. He presented his newest guess, a specially woven fishing trap with small holes that he hoped might hold water. He reasoned that the device was meant for catching fish, but could theoretically catch other items as well. But once again, Chiamaka shook her head. The riddle wasn't about a fishing trap, and the explanation she offered, without using a single mocking word, still stung. He was wrong, and he was nearly out of time. At this point, Odion's patience snapped. The murmuring villagers, the children peeking around his feet, the older men and women murmuring to each other. It felt as though they were all mocking him. He stormed away, ignoring the curious stares that followed him. Behind closed doors in his compound, Odion struggled with a problem he had never faced before: humility. He began to realize that his money and status could not buy him an immediate solution. His final day to solve the riddle was approaching, and the looming possibility of failure made him increasingly agitated. He snapped at his servants and demanded that his wives and advisers keep brainstorming day and night. The chief grew dishevelled, pacing in circles and tossing aside foolish suggestions with a snarl. Yet nothing seemed to click. Pots with tiny cracks leaked water. Sacks with small holes worked no better than baskets. Somebody suggested folding cloth into a pouch with stitched holes, but that plan collapsed once tested. The riddle's solution remained elusive, and dawn was near. The third day arrived with a thick, tense heat hanging over the village. By sunrise, the square was bustling. People stood in clusters, discussing the many guesses that had been tried. Elders recalled other riddles they had heard in their youth, adding to the air of curiosity. Odion approached the square without his usual grandeur. His once gleaming chains looked dull in the harsh morning light. His face was set in a grim expression. Behind him, a line of weary advisers trailed along, avoiding the judgmental glances of the villagers. The crowd parted quietly. With what remained of his composure, Odion delivered his final guess, a clay jar that contained several cracks. It had holes, so it seemed likely that water could seep in and remain there for a time. Perhaps it was used to catch something else too. Everyone awaited Chiamaka's response, bracing themselves to see if Odion had finally cracked the puzzle. But she stepped forward, took a moment to let the suspense build, then clearly revealed that he was still wrong. There was a sudden hush, and then a wave of murmuring spread through the crowd. Odion closed his eyes in dread, realizing he had failed. He could feel the weight of the villagers' stares, their awe and amusement at his downfall. Never before had they seen this proud figure looking so unsure of himself. Chiamaka stood calmly, explaining that the correct answer was a sponge, an object that certainly had plenty of holes, could hold water, and was indeed used for catching drips or spills, even though it wasn't a net. As she laid out the reasoning with plain clarity, nobody could argue. It was obvious, yet not one of Odion's many advisers had suggested it. All at once, the tension broke. Some in the crowd gasped. Others laughed in disbelief at how obvious it seemed after hearing it explained. Children hopped in excitement, and a few elders nodded wisely. The talk around the square turned to how a man so rich could be so blind to simple truths. The chief stared at the ground, seething with humiliation. He knew better than to lash out. Everyone in that crowd had seen the simple weaver claim her victory. If he tried to force her to marry him now, the entire region would consider him an even bigger fool. Wealth alone couldn't rescue his pride. The moment Chiamaka began gathering her weaving supplies, the crowd gave her space. They admired her for her boldness. She took her time, calmly lifting her loom and bundling her neatly woven cloth. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Odion standing there, speechless, in the center of the village square. The news of the chief's failure spread quickly. Boatmen carried stories down the river. Traders shared them in distant markets. People repeated the riddle to friends and family, retelling how Chiamaka had refused a wealthy chief and triumphed with cleverness. In some versions of the tale, they emphasized her calm composure. In others, they focused on Odion's massive ego. But at the heart of every version was the same message. An independent, smart woman had proven that not all wealth is worth chasing. In the weeks that followed, the villagers saw less of Odion. He seemed to have lost his taste for public appearances. Occasionally, he would still send servants to buy Chiamaka's woven cloth, but he never came in person again. The shame of failing her riddle lingered around him like a cloud he couldn't disperse. Meanwhile, Chiamaka continued her daily life with the same steady rhythm as before. She rose early, lit her small clay stove, and then settled at the loom with bright fibres. Customers came from near and far. Some asked her for riddles of their own, hoping to test their wit. Others just marvelled at her skill. A few asked if she might reconsider marriage with them, but it was clear to everyone that she would decide if and when she wanted to marry, and for no other reason than her own choice. Over time, villagers began telling an informal version of the story, with Chiamaka as the unstoppable weaver and Odion as a cautionary figure. Young girls in particular loved hearing the tale. It gave them a spark of boldness and a reminder that they too could demand respect. Parents would remind their children that no amount of jewelry or cattle could replace genuine intelligence and a strong will. Yet Chiamaka never rubbed her victory in Odion's face, nor did she become arrogant. She simply carried on, living her life by her own standards. Word travelled to other lands about the weaver who had overcome a wealthy chief's arrogance with nothing more than a single riddle. Some travellers who passed through the village insisted on meeting her, convinced there had to be something extraordinary about her. But they would usually find a calm woman, dressed in practical clothes, busily preparing another run of vibrant cloth. Not long after these events, neighbouring villages hosted a seasonal gathering. Dancers, drummers, traders, and storytellers appeared in a vast celebration that lasted several days. Chiamaka attended briefly, selling her cloth and greeting friends. People recognized her from the famous story and asked her to confirm rumors. Did the chief really bring an entire herd of cattle? Did he throw gold coins at her feet? She nodded, amused by how big the stories had grown, even if they were somewhat exaggerated. She did not stay at the festival long. Crowds were not her preference. She preferred the quieter corners of life, where she could hear her own thoughts. But the energy of the gathering reminded her that despite the clamour, she had remained true to herself. There was no lonely castle to regret leaving behind, no wave of guilt over not taking Odion's riches. Instead, she felt a satisfying peace. Back in her home, she refocused on her weaving. New patterns danced in her imagination. New colour combinations sparked her creativity. The villagers supported her with fresh orders. Travellers sought unique gifts to bring home. Though she was well known, her life was still simple. Whenever she took a break from weaving, she would stroll through the village, greet old neighbours, and smile at the children who teased each other by repeating her riddle. They leapt around, trying to guess as if they had been there that day. At times, they proudly recited the answer to newcomers, saying it was a sponge, something so common, yet so perfect for her puzzle. Chiamaka's tale became a local legend. People shared it around fires at night, telling how a chief with unmatched wealth had come seeking the weaver's hand, only to be bested by a simple riddle. Over time, the story gained a title: Why African Girls Don't Marry into Rich Families. The title poked fun at the assumption that every young woman must be dazzled by gold. It reminded everyone that if a man valued his riches more than his capacity to learn and listen, then wealth became meaningless. In the years that followed, Chiamaka remained steadfast in her independent life. Whenever someone asked for advice, she would calmly suggest that they consider what truly mattered: the ability to think, to respect others, and to stay true to themselves. She did not lecture anyone, nor did she claim to know all the answers. She simply reminded them that they held power within themselves to shape their own futures. Chief Odion eventually recovered some of his dignity, though he never forgot the day he failed so publicly. For the rest of his life, he avoided riddles and puzzles, having learned the hard way that cleverness and self-respect can be more valuable than possessions. Chiamaka's story spread far beyond her home region. Traders brought it east, west, and across rivers. People loved hearing about the weaver who refused to be dazzled by a chief's gold. They admired how her riddle forced him to realize that money alone could not command every situation or every heart. Decades later, children still ask their grandparents to tell them the tale of Chiamaka and the chief who was confounded by a simple puzzle. They giggled at how he tried basket after basket, jar after jar, before finally hearing the truth. And they remembered that, in the end, Chiamaka walked away with her dignity and independence, richer in spirit than any chief could ever buy. In this way, the legend of Chiamaka lives on, a shining example of wit over wealth, pride overcome by wisdom, and a reminder that no amount of gold can outshine a free and clever mind. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more exciting stories from the heart of Africa.